Welcome to Microcollege. Today, we are very honored to have as our guest Dr. Pavel Cenkl, who is the Director of Learning and Land at the head of school at Schumacher College, which is located in Devon in the southwest of England. Pavel has worked for more than 2 decades in higher education in America and has always been drawn to colleges and universities whose curriculum fully integrates learning and with practice and thinking with embodiment. Having taught and served as dean for nearly 15 years at Vermont's Sterling College, Pavel brings a depth of experience to Schumacher College and Dartington's trust approach to experiential learning. While pursuing research in ecologically minded curriculum design and teaching courses in environmental philosophy, Pavel is also a passionate endurance and adventure runner. Over the past 5 years, through a project called Climate Run, Pavel has covered hundreds of miles in the Arctic and subarctic on foot in order to bring attention to connections with our bodies and the more than human world in the face of rapidly changing climate. Pavel holds a PhD in English and is the author of many articles, chapters, and 2 books, Nature and Culture in the Northern Forest, Region, Heritage, and Environment in the Rural Northeast, and this vast book of nature, Writing the Landscape in New Hampshire's White Mountains. He's currently working on a book titled Resilience in the North, Adventure, Endurance, and the Limits of the Human, which threads together personal narrative and observation with environmental philosophy and reflections on what it means to be human. So thank you again for joining us, Pavel.
Well, thank you, Jacob. It's a real pleasure, and thanks for reaching out. And I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, lots of things I'd like to talk with you about. Lots of connections to our work here at Thoreau College. As I mentioned, as we were getting on, both Schumacher College and Sterling College are important inspirations. Really, I think, see as models and leaders with years of experience in the kind of work that we're trying to do here in Wisconsin. But here on Microcollege, on the podcast, we always like to start with people's biographies. So I want to ask you to reach back to when you were 18, 19, 20, 21 years old and think about, just give us a picture of where you were during that time period. What were the big influences on you, people, places, ideas, and how did that shape the path that you took?
Wow. Well, that seems like a very long time ago, if you ask me. So that would have been, oh my goodness. I think I started college in 1988. So that was quite a time back. And I went to Brandeis University, just outside of Boston in Massachusetts. And, as I think about those times, I was there for 3.5 years and majored in English. So I have a BA, an MA, and a PhD all in English, although many would argue they aren't in English at all. They're actually more in environmental humanities and philosophy and those sorts of subjects. But I really looked forward to when I was an undergraduate, not just the academic side of things, but I found myself quite occupied when I wasn't in class, by escaping to the mountains, and going out into the world. And I had a background. My parents fortunately were able to take me up to northern New Hampshire and to spend a bit of time in the White Mountains, the national forest there, and really got to explore and got to know those mountains quite intimately. And so as I became an adult, I continued in that, and was summiting all sorts of mountains in different seasons, and camping out and taking friends up there, and most of whom hated the experience, but became engaged with the outdoor club at Brandeis, and took up rock climbing and some more of the technical pursuits and ice climbing and things like that. Just any way to really spend more time outside. And as I'm sure you're aware, rock climbing and ice climbing were not the sports then that they are today. The accessibility was relatively limited, and people looked at you as you were kind of a bizarre person as you were doing those things. And so that was probably part of the appeal, do something that's quite different, and kind of out there. And there were certainly fewer people engaged in those pursuits at the time, so it felt a bit like you were doing something quite extreme. And as I continued through college, I actually got a job with the Appalachian Mountain Club, who run a series of huts and do trail maintenance and support for throughout the White Mountain National Forest. And during my sort of college summers, I worked there, and then after I graduated, I also worked there for a winter. working in the huts and sort of supporting backpackers that came up. And that gave me immediate access and opportunity to the intimacy of the mountains and the landscape that was there. And I think my first endurance event or experience was actually I just want to check because you're
Yep, you just froze until this moment. So
yeah.
maybe you
Okay,
could step back a
where do I
couple
start?
moments and say, yeah, this is your first experience with endurance.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's actually during that time that I had my first experience with endurance, running, sort of, hiking really quickly, in what they describe as the hut traverse, 52 miles, from one end of the White Mountains to the other. And it was the first time that I'd been on my feet for 20 hours, doing that sort of thing, and I absolutely fell in love with it. And then spent a week recovering from that, and then resume my job, but kind of knew in my bones that was something that I wanted to return to. And interestingly, I didn't really, in any sort of real way until I was in my 30s. Not to that extent, not following those distances. And maybe it was sort of the increase in accessibility and popularity of endurance running as a sport that drew me in a little bit more. But certainly my experiences in the White Mountains led me to to pursue my PhD, which really focused on that region. And I was really quite keen to look at how a landscape transforms from these are certainly loaded terms, right? So from frontier to tourist economy. And so effectively how, through a sort of literary cultural history lens, the White Mountains specifically in this case, evolved in sort of the public perception and in descriptions and representations from probably about 1785 through to 1910, 1911, the passage of the Weeks Act, and moving forward into the 20th century. And that allowed me not just to engage in amazing reading and sort of transformative, scholarship that was going on at the time. This would have been in the mid to late 90s, but also to do field work and to go to the places that these authors were writing about and then from, and to know that Jeremy Belknap, when he was one of the first sort of European Americans to climb Mount Washington, right? To sort of follow his footsteps and sort of see where he stopped and why he turned around and what his decisions were like. That was really important to me. So I think throughout, so even those early years and then throughout the PhD and even today with that Climate Run project that you talked about, for me, going into the landscape to witness and to participate and to be at that intersection of the human and more than human world has really been fundamental to my professional and to my personal pursuits.
Yeah. Amazing, like holistic vision of life and of say an academic or a scholarly pursuit, which is also embodied and physical in the way. I think that I get a real sense from everything you do is that intersection of the body and the mind and the exactly. Landscape, right, is beautiful and something close to our hearts. Obviously, we've picked up Henry David Thoreau's name, and you're there. You've spent a lot of time there in Thoreau country, and I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, he modeled a certain way, something that's inspiring to us, at least in that way at an earlier phase in our civilization.
Absolutely. I have many well-thumbed copies of most of Thoreau's works, and tends to even now inflict some passages from Thoreau on students at Schumacher College and say, no, but look, this is absolutely relevant here, and here's why. And
definitely it's the case of a thinker who's been so influential that it becomes sort of cliche almost, some of the things that he said. But he was
that's right.
Yeah. Well, beautiful. So I think there's a lot that we could talk about here. I think one of my goals though is to share with our audience and something about Schumacher College, where you are now, which is a fascinating, revolutionary, trail-breaking kind of institution. And so maybe could you give us a portrait of what Schumacher College is? Because I think it really is not comparable to almost anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll provide a slightly larger context because I think that's also helpful. And also just to note, there was one book that you missed out on your sort of intro, which is a book that I co-edited with the Schumacher College founder Satish Kumar titled Transformative Learning.
Oh, wonderful.
I happen to have a copy right here, which I could put up on the
There you
screen.
go.
Yeah, there it is.
Yes.
Um,
Head, heart, and
and,
hands.
and we put that out, yeah, Head, Heart, and Hands. And we put that out, a year and a half ago or so. And subsequently, we've actually published another book titled Regenerative Learning that I don't co-edit, but I have a chapter in. So really, I think we're coming to a point where, maybe I'll work backwards. We're coming to a point where we've had 32 years of head, heart, and hands learning and sort of embodied community, ecologically focused learning at Schumacher College, as well as 100 years of transformative learning at Dartington Trust, which is the charity of which Schumacher College is a part. And so we've published in quite rapid succession 2 books that really focus on the educational process here and where its origins, where it comes from, and where it's headed in the next century. And as part of that, we're actually launching a new master's in transformative education, which is beginning this September. And that really, for me, helps to encapsulate a lot of what we've been doing over the last 30 or 100 years, and give people the skills and the tools that they need to then make transformative change in the world, through an educational MA, an education focused MA. So that's sort of where we are at the moment and moving forward. If we jump back 100 years or so, then the building that I'm sitting in now, actually the room that I'm sitting in, was one of the rooms that was occupied by Dorothy and Leonard Elmhurst. So a couple who were inspired. Dorothy Elmhurst was formerly Dorothy Whitney, who was raised in New York City, and became, I think, one of the wealthiest women in the country at age of 17 when she inherited $500 million. And she founded some wonderful things in New York, such as the New School for Social Research and the New Republic magazine, and was really into very progressive social transformative organizations and change. And she, I think it's her second husband, Leonard Elmhurst, was similarly interested in sort of agriculture and agroforestry, and industry and enterprise. And they were both inspired by these transformative educational pioneers. John Dewey, for example, was a real foundational influence on anybody who's in experiential education. And she actually was a friend of the Whitney family, or he was a friend of the Whitney family, and so there was a collaboration happening there. And Leonard Elmhurst was inspired by Rabindranath Tagore, who, the Nobel Prize winner, who also transformed the educational system in India at about the same time. And between the influence of those 2 real transformative pioneers in education, Dorothy and Leonard came together and wanted to start a school. And so they were inspired to come to this place, to the Dartington estate, in South Devon, in rural Southwest England. There's an old falling down medieval estate in the 1920s, and they said, that's where we want. They had the benefit of bringing quite a bit of capital, so to be able to rebuild the buildings, be able to start all sorts of enterprises and experiments on the land, and really began a process that they describe as an experiment in rural regeneration, which helped to support industry in and around the land. So, developing community relationships, developing it wasn't called agroecology then, but effectively, forestry and agriculture in concert with ecological systems, really innovative, progressive learning in the arts, and across actually what we describe today as a center for learning at the intersection of arts, ecology, and social justice. And really, that's what they were doing. Imagine in the 20s and 30s, in England, doing that, right? We recently dedicated one of our rooms to the social activist and entrepreneur Michael Young, who was really quite well known, globally, certainly in this country, for the Labour Party manifesto, which set the stage for organizations like the NHS, the National Health Service, or the Arts Council, or the School for Social Entrepreneurs, and all sorts of social transformative change. And he came here as a boy of 12. And came to school at the Dartington School in the 40s, and the school was founded on these principles of we want to be sort of student driven, we want students to participate in the governance, what needs to be practice led, experiential. And the first thing, Michael's daughter was here to sort of dedicate the room. She said one of the first things that he was asked to do is by Leonard Elmhurst, what do you want to do? What business do you want to start? So he very quickly had started a business at age of 12 of selling eggs, right? And he learned how to repair motors. And only then did he start to think about, some of the, some of the sort of more intellectual pursuits and other skills. So what we have done with the development of Schumacher College from 1991 onward is to take that to heart. Effectively say, what is practice-led learning? And how can we actually begin with the doing and use that as an entry point to sort of open up the context and open up the conversations around global connections, around our ability to leverage change, our ability to be transformative. And because that's an experiential and embodied process that students are immediately drawn into, whether it's in the classroom and doing particular projects that then they reflect on and see the context for, or if it's living in community and working in the college gardens, or helping to prepare the food, or participating in the rhythms of the day, all of those become sort of part of the embodied practice that then enhances the overall learning and the transformative experience that they have. And we found that that's absolutely true. That even if students come here for a short period, whether it's 1 or 2 weeks, then sometimes that's sufficient to just sort of spark a little bit of interest in like, all right, how can I take this what I've learned here, and how can I make that bigger?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, amazing. Yeah, so maybe could you talk a little bit about the sort of the scope and structure of these programs? My sense is that there's actually a lot of change and there's development going on right now there about this.
There is. So we're in a midst, I think every college always needs to be, right, in the midst of an evolutionary process. And so, for instance, I've been here for 4 years, came in 2019 in the autumn. And when I arrived, there were 2 postgraduate programs running at Schumacher, and there were 23 students enrolled in those 2 programs together. Typically the college had run 2 programs, maybe occasionally a third, and then a series of short courses as well over the course of the year, about 30 of them. So people would come for a week or for 3 days and learn something quite specific. Now we have about 120 students, and we run about 90 different short courses over the year. And in addition to the 8 postgraduate programs we started an undergraduate program in regenerative food and farming. So what we've done in this relatively short period during a global pandemic, when for a period of time there, we weren't allowed to have students, we had to have students online only. We've been able to look at what are the needs in the world, and what are students coming to us wanting to know, wanting to learn, and then what are the best skills and tools that we can provide to an intergenerational cohort of students to go off and make that transformative change, and what processes do we need to have in place. So we did make some transitions right in 2019, where this was before the pandemic, and thankfully we made these. We lowered our tuition fees by about 40%. We transformed most of our postgraduate programs to low residency, which means that students come for between 2 and 5 weeks at a time in residence, and then they go off and they hopefully will start applying some of what they've learned in their home communities or in their workplace, and then they come back again and repeat that over the course of the year. So each master's program is approximately 10 months long. It's quite an intensive program, usually 4 taught modules and then a dissertation module. And then our undergraduate program is more fully residential. So in the UK, an undergraduate degree is 3 years typically. So we're in the sort of latter half of our first year of the BSc, and we're right now recruiting for a second cohort. And so hopefully, by the end of year 3, we'll actually have probably, I would say, about 50% of all Schumacher students will be engaged specifically in food and farming related courses. Whether it's, we've got a master's program in regenerative food farming and enterprise. We also have a certificate-based 6-month residency in agroecology, so practical agroecology. And those students are here from April to October each year. And so really the focus is shifting, slightly to thinking much more practically and acting much more practically in the service of food systems and food systems transformation. We're in the beginnings of a conversation around developing a program in food systems leadership, so that we can do that on a much larger scale. And we're even stepping outside. One of the important pieces for me is that not only do we have this beautiful 1,200-acre estate, which has, it's quite a complex, structure here. We have residential tenancies, we've got, business tenants, we've got 4 active farms run by different partners. We have a 100-acre, ancient woodland with a ancient scheduled monument embedded in it. We've got 6 kilometers of river frontage on the River Dart that's on the estate. It's an absolutely beautiful place. I feel like I'm on holiday whenever I come to work. But at the same time, that can be a bit of a trap, right?
Right.
Because, we are, it's a 3.5-hour train ride from London. It's not the most accessible place to come. Yet historically, it's been a place where people have gravitated to from around the world and come here to have these amazing experiences, whether in the Summer School of Music, which has been running for 70 years to bring, all sorts of world-renowned composers here, or whether it's people like James Lovelock and, Tagore himself and others coming in, to support the learning on the learning side. It's also the case that we've got this global network, because people come in and then they go back out again. And I often, share that many of our Schumacher graduates seem to want to begin a Schumacher College wherever they end up. And so because of that, we have these wonderful partners in places like Peru and Colombia and Brazil and South Africa and India and Japan and China and Australia, and all over the world, that have these sort of upstart communities, right, that are about community living and embodied practice and experiential learning and living, and very often about food production and food systems generation. So we're also developing, right now in partnership with the UN Development Program, a global network, a global learning network in conscious food systems, where we're creating this sort of ground up curriculum design that's built on what all of these partners from around the world can contribute, because recognizing there's expertise all over the place, and that we can be, our service is as facilitators to help that equitable exchange of knowledge and experience across a network like that. So for me, it's not only do I want people to engage in practice-led experiential learning here in this beautiful place, but I also want to be able to reach out, and we historically have been, but to reach out in new ways now, with the technologies that we have available, to be able to leverage even greater change, and to support people who would never have the opportunity to come to a place like this.
Yeah, that's really exciting, right? I think that's our history here at Thoreau College is much shorter than that one, and our footprint is at this point much smaller. But even we also see that our students, our people who have any contact here also want to bring this idea elsewhere, and it does seem like a part of the mission, really. And it's cool to see that happening on a global level in the way that you're describing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think you're one of the things that stands out about Schumacher. Schumacher College is named after E.F. Schumacher, the writer of the famous "Small is Beautiful," which is a very influential book in our local community. And this humanly scaled kind of enterprises of microcolleges and so forth takes a lot from those ideas. You as you're describing, some growth and development from a situation where you have 23 people, living together in a remote location, to 120 or 200 people who are in different stages of remote or low residency kind of engagement. How are you working with that transition with some of these core values of head, heart, and hands engagement and this kind of small is beautiful E.F. Schumacher kind of thing?
Well, I mean, honestly, that's a key question for us. How to be able to continue to do the sort of community-led learning, really. Because it all comes down to that sort of experience in community and working with fellow students, staff, volunteers, residential volunteers who we have, in the context of also being as accessible and affordable as possible, and not wanting to limit access as much as we possibly can. So, one, just to reflect, this is the, I think, 60th anniversary of the publication of Small is Beautiful. So there are all sorts of events, going on that we're participating in as well. And it's interesting is, I often have there's these discussions about, well, what is small, right? Or, to take another term from Schumacher, what is appropriate technology? And what, because those definitions, I think, are quite open, and they were defined in a particular way 60 years ago. And I think we can define them in a contemporary way now. And I remember conversations when I was at Sterling College when, we had sort of similar ideas. I think we had like 60 students or 70 students. And, we recognized that to maintain some financial sustainability, we needed to grow at least a little bit. So what was that magic number of students? And somebody said 125. Beyond 125, then it becomes too big. And somebody said, well, 200, beyond 200, and somebody said 60. And so, I think it really depends on how you approach the relationships within that community. I think one other example that's useful here is, I'm describing us as being, I keep looking out the window because it's so beautiful out there. I'm sorry. I'm looking at a grade 2 listed garden outside my office window, which is sort of contrary potentially to some of the things we're talking about. Is beautifully manicured garden that people come and actually pay entry to come see, which we can come back to how that might be part of a more complex estate. But we are on this 1,200 acre estate, so where I'm sitting is probably at about a mile from where a lot of the Schumacher classes happen. Some of them happen in the buildings that are near me, but we're actually quite spread out on the campus or on the estate itself, which has some of its challenges in terms of how do you sort of define community in terms if you can't all sit in the same room at the same time. And so we do create opportunities for people to sit in the same room at the same time or to gather together as much as we possibly can. We have a head of community learning, a woman called Sarah Gray, who helps to organize both the residential volunteers who have been sort of instrumental to Schumacher. So people come and volunteer here for, I think it's between 1 month and 9 months, and we provide them with accommodation and meals, and then they work in service of the learning community. And interact with the students and sometimes participate in some of the learning programs. And I think we have about 10 of them at the moment. So thinking about that scale, about 10 for 120 students, that's actually an interesting ratio to help sort of support that community piece. And we're right now, as we're growing, we're continuing to put new sort of supports and structures in place. So working with Sarah to develop residential wardens and people who add a bit more continuity to the structure. And we also look at some of our programs which are longer residency, such as the undergraduate course. And we actually met with one of our students yesterday, said, well, we're the first group that's going to be here for 3 years. How can we participate more in the development of the community, since they have perhaps more of a vested interest than somebody who's here for 2 weeks? So it is an interesting sort of puzzle, and we talk about it as a flow of sort of people coming in, staying, and then other people overlapping and then coming together. And it, in some respects, it's absolutely beautiful, but logistically, it can be kind of a challenge to create those spaces where, sometimes I describe it as scaffolding spontaneity. Where our job is to create this scaffold so that people can bump into each other and have these wonderful conversations, or have a work experience together with students that they don't have classes with, and things like that. So there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, but I'll say it's not without its challenges. Absolutely.
Yeah, that is touching so many questions that are very actively being explored here at Thorough College. We're speaking here in mid-May, and we are just this week, the last couple of days, welcoming in a new group of students for a shorter program, a 1-month program. They're joining a group of students who've been here for 3 or 4 months in advance. And so exactly this process of weaving together 2 groups for a different season and different kind of cycle of outdoor activities and academic activities. We also have 1 or 2 day session folk school classes with people who come. So we're doing a lot of these same things, and it is the goal. The beautiful things that you're describing about people bumping into each other and working together. Building a scaffolding is a good metaphor for that, because that is part of the weaving that happens in a place like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And for every time that it's wonderful to bump into somebody, then you realize, well, I'm bumping into them because the line for the food is really long, because there are all these extra people here that weren't here last week, right? And so want to make sure that we work all those systems through. So yeah, it's a bit tricky, but it also we're transitioning in some of our physical spaces as well. So, for 3 years, we were not allowed to use the sort of main building that most of the Schumacher classes happen in, the old postern it's called, because the roof had collapsed. And so we spent 3 years sort of project managing a new roof for that building, and only in November did we start getting back in. So there's this whole sort of movement, this transition, and an interesting question, for Thoreau scholars, for example, is identity.
Oh no, Pavel, it's frozen again.
Sorry about that. Let me know when I'm back.
Yep, you're back now. Yep. A question for Thoreau scholars.
Yes. So apologies for the internet.
Don't apologize for the internet.
So I think an interesting question for Thoreau scholars is, is place, right, so fundamental to identity that you can't take that identity and move it somewhere else and to create that place to be your own, right? So, if you're so invested in a particular building or a particular, landscape, can you take that same sense of community and move it someplace else and sort of rebuild that same community? And of course, it will be different because you're in a slightly different place. But I think we have found over the last, I haven't been here that long, but over the last decade, that the college has moved around a bit. And I think it's a testament to the sort of the strength of community that you can put it somewhere else. And it can flourish in different and new ways and use facilities that you never knew could be used in those particular ways. But for me, that's actually really fascinating.
Yeah, so place-based education is a key principle that we're working with here. Obviously, you've devoted much of your life to places and thinking about places and its role in education. And you've got an institution that's bringing people, instructors and students from everywhere in the world to a very particular place.
Yep.
That's an interesting question. What is the meaning of a place-based education, like that for people who are not from there and probably won't stay there, most of them. They will go back to their homes or somewhere else in the world entirely.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. And as I talk about sort of more distributed global learning networks, right, that's an attempt to, reach people who are obviously in different places and have connections to different places, cultures, communities, time zones, economies, politics, et cetera, and bring them into a sort of more coherent network where we could sort of have that exchange of learning and knowledge. And it's really interesting. I mean, I'm reflecting on the sort of similarities between here and where Sterling College is in northern Vermont. Vermont itself, it seems to be a magnet for innovation in progressive land management and in value-added food production and in agriculture and cheese production. And just I was able to benefit really greatly from all the breweries and all the cheese producers and all of the delicious food that was happening in that area of Vermont. Similarly to South Devon, lots of enterprise, lots of people come here and say, all right, I can have some access to land here. I can, sort of try this experiment. And, right here on the estate, we've got people that make kefir, we have people that make kimchi, bake bagels. There's this amazing relocalization project of heritage grains where they grow 40 tons of heritage grain on the estate. And there's a partnership with 2 other partners where they actually use a mill that was imported from Vermont to grind the wheat into flour and bake it and sell it in a bakery here in town. And it's just this amazing project, which reminds me a lot of what was happening in Vermont when I was there. And I'm sure it's in many, many other places, but there seem to be sort of these areas where people gravitate to because of the place, and the place creates the opportunity for community. And then the community then sort of reconnects people to place. And I was having a visit from an organization called the Orchard Project, which here in the UK works to develop in partnership with often urban communities, right, to develop community orchards and effectively to plant or manage the orchard, but also to manage and plant the seeds of community. And we had a long conversation around the connection between soil health and community health. And what if as we do, we talk about regenerative processes and regenerative food and farming, that idea of regeneration has its roots in soil health and soil productivity and so on, right? And sort of a constant enfolding and refolding into an ecological system to actually make it better than it was. So it's not sort of sustaining some arbitrary sustainability level, but it's actually, let's make it better. Let's work in concert with ecological systems to grow things better. And so, my sort of theory, and I think it has been sort of proven, but we're trying to create more quantitative data around it, is that there is a distinct connection between the health of the soil and the health of the community. And for me, that's as clear a connection to place as you could possibly have, right? And what we can demonstrate here is that vibrancy of that connection. That in fact, through our agricultural processes, through our land management, through our work together as in a community, we have this impact on the land that then has an impact on the learning, on the community, and then can go off into the world, because students hopefully will learn that's a connection you can make anywhere. And here are the ways that you can frame that. So you can do it in Peru, you can do it in India, you can do it in these other places. Right? So for me, it's the transfer of that, which I think is obviously a key to all experiential learning. How do you transfer that into what sometimes students call, I think disparagingly, the real world, right? Because I live here and I work here. This is my real world. But how do you take that in other contexts, right? That might not be here.
Yeah, fantastic. And that you've answered the question I was going to ask next. Really was to characterize the relationship between Schumacher College and the surrounding community. But I think, yeah, clearly profound and extensive.
Yeah, and complex, absolutely complex. I mentioned we've got all of these commercial partnerships, and we have 25 land-based partners, or tenants rather, including a number of active farms. Everything from a nationally recognized biodynamic farm to a farm that has a veg box scheme and a CSA, to sort of equine therapy, to all sorts of things are going on. All of which I'd love for our students to partner with, and many of those places do offer placements for our students, and so we have a sense of sort of collaboration there. But I always think, is there more that we could be doing? So we're continuing to explore ways that, whether through formal structures, MOUs or other sorts of contractual relationships, or through the incidental community working, because there is a fair bit of sharing resources. We might, a farm might take the manure from the horse, from the equine therapy, concern, and use that for fertilizer. And, those sorts of sharing of resources as well as ideas go on all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing and very inspiring, to what we hope to do here. I'm wondering, in all that you're describing, and this is the impression I've had of Schumacher for a long time, is there are all of these different facets, many different things going on, different lengths of programs, different types of focus, from the arts to sustainable agriculture to these conferences and all kinds of things. Would you say, there seems to be, a strong aesthetic, a strong kind of ethical and philosophical core to all of this, and how do you maintain that and cultivate that, and all the people who are coming in, how do you connect to the kind of a kind of an epistemological or philosophical kind of shared vision of reality with all those things going on?
Well, I mean, I'll admit I'm wary of shared visions of the world, because I think what I'd love to think that we do is actually open up people's sort of minds to the multiplicity of visions of the world, and to think about how we can look at sort of expertise from indigenous communities, or expertise from from the historical past, or expertise from the contemporary present, and bring people who are interested in technology and philosophy and economics and design all together. And I think that for me is the strength of the teaching that we do. So I think there is an underpinning sort of pedagogical approach. So if we have a shared philosophy, it's around the head, heart, and hands approach to learning. It's around the practice-led, embodied approaches that are grounded in community and ecological thinking. It was I think it was in 2017 or somewhere, that I was in Austin at the South by Southwest EDU conference, and I gave a talk on ecology as a model for teaching. Mm-hmm. And I made the point there that I've been saying over and over again throughout the years, and that it does find its way into some of the chapters in the books that I've written, that from the very assignment that you do in the classroom and sort of the day-to-day, all the way up to the governance of the organization, right? There is an ecological model that is about resilience, that's about sort of regenerative processes, that's not about verticality, but it's about sort of horizontal structures and depth of structures, and sort of constant collaboration and transparency and engagement. That, it seems like a basic question, but how can you teach about ecological ideas and concepts without living those concepts in every fiber of your being, right? Which, again, in the context of the real world that we live in, can be a really challenging place to be. Ecology doesn't always, pay the bills. So we have to constantly think about sort of the real world, not the real world again, but sort of the I don't know, multifaceted contexts in which we live, right? So that we can focus on these ideas of ecological thinking that I think are essential to underpin any sort of change or transformation we're going to make in the world, but to make sure that they are truly sort of financially sustainable and viable, so that they can be replicated in other places. And people see this not just as, oh, this is a cool model that they're doing down at Schumacher, but you can't really do that.
Right.
And there are plenty of examples of places like Schumacher that have tried to do this, but have not been successful in the long term. I'm quite aware, it's a sensitive subject for me that, liberal arts colleges in the US are not, where they used to be. And there have been quite a few small college closures. And so I think, coming back to the network concept, when people ask me, maybe this is drawing some threads together as well from our conversation, when people ask me about scale, right, and say, well, the only way to make it, financially sustainable is to get to X number of students. I say, well, X number of students isn't really sort of ecologically sustainable, but if you've got, 200 students here and then 200 students over here and then a couple hundred over here, and they are rigorously networked so that they can share experiences, they can do cross-teaching, they can go visit one another, they can be online together and all of that, then all of a sudden you've got, 1,000, 10,000 students all networked in together. And that, I think, is an ecological scaling up that we need to pursue more.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's definitely it's a vision that that really resonates with me. And the ecological image there is powerful. And so yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think it related to, I think in the last few minutes that we have here, I wanted to talk a bit about your interest in and practice of sort of embodiment through the climate run, through these endurance kind of related things, and also a word that I see coming up in your work a lot is the word resilience. And and what practices, let's start with the climate run and these kind of embodied practices. What does that focus on that bring into a person's development, into their education, in a more holistic sense?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And that's there's so many ways I could answer that. And well, I guess let me start with there's a period where I had a slight shift in sort of responsibilities, gave me just a little bit more time, back at about 2013, 2014, somewhere around there. And I had, begun trail running and endurance running in earnest, as I said earlier, in my 30s or so, and then was thinking about, well, that's fun and all, and it gets me out into the world and is really sort of self-serving and allows me to become more resilient by effectively re-energizing myself, through my connection with the more than human world. And I think Thoreau was quite fond of doing that himself, right? Climbing to the tops of trees and hanging out there. And
we've adopted the saunter as a regular practice. So
oh, excellent, good. And he was very creative etymology around saunter, right? So the wilderness in the backyard, whether it's that or whether it's actually going off into what we might describe as true wilderness, both of those were quite important to me. So, but there came a time when I thought, well, all right, my background is also in environmental humanities and in philosophy, and how do I, and in ecological thinking, and how can I bring these things together in a way that they actually help something, that they serve some purpose. And I set myself some fairly substantial goals. Like, let's go run across Iceland, for example, and thought, all right, well, let's give that a shot. And my original thinking around it was, and I got sponsors and went out there, was supported by family along the way. It was really amazing, amazing journey. And so across Iceland for 150 miles or so over 3 days, just to be clear about that. And I thought going into it, this is going to be about, well, let's see if we can leverage some of these product manufacturers to use more eco-friendly products and to try to minimize the impact on the environment through participating in these sports already. But it very quickly came clear to me, even during that first event, that it was less about that. It was more about the human connection to place. That as I was going across places where the impact of climate change was much more visible than it was, in the Northeast US, for example, where I was literally running by mountains where there used to be a glacier 5 years ago, there was no longer a glacier. And in 2014, there was actually the first study that was able to connect post-glacial or isostatic rebound when glaciers melt in Iceland to anthropogenic climate change. So they were literally able to connect the dots and measure post-glacial uplift at amazing velocities of about 30 or 40 centimeters or millimeters per year. Millimeters, not centimeters, millimeters per year, but literally almost enough so you could sit there and watch the Earth's crust rebound as a result of greenhouse gases caused by anthropogenic climate change, and or vice versa. And I wanted to be in those places, and it became quite quickly as I did that run and as I ran across Arctic Scandinavia, up the Nordkalottleiden trail between Norway and Sweden and Finland. Visited Svalbard for some running and the Faroe Islands and other sorts of places, as well as some in the US. It was about sort of going back and giving large-scale presentations to all sorts of different audiences about, look at these beautiful pictures of this landscape, which is then now being impacted by what we're doing here. So let's connect those dots for ourselves. And then also, how can our participation in things like endurance running or things, whatever sports you are, because you're participating in, how can that, by recognizing your place in the world and your connection to the more than human, begin to build a more resilient relationship between yourself and the world around you, which hopefully then can precipitate change, right? So all of that is to say that when I started developing specific programs in applications of environmental philosophy, and teaching a course on trail running at Sterling College, and developing the master's program in movement, mind, and ecology here at Schumacher, that was at the heart of those. And I just gave a seminar to the movement, mind, ecology students a week ago, and I showed them a picture of this was the moment in Norway when I thought about this program at first, because this was the moment where I felt absolute blur between the human and the more than human. Like I was, some people call it a runner's high. I think it's quite different than that, but it's recognizing your vulnerability in the context of a much larger world. And I use the term more than human to sort of designate, we're just part of this bigger thing. We're not other than it. And so I wanted to create programs that give entry point for students to experience that same thing. And then again, to use that as an entry point to understanding that context and moving it forward.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I think for listeners that part of the context, we were put in touch with you, Pavel, by one of your students just completing this movement, mind, and ecology master's program with a focus. Each student, as I understand it, chooses a different movement discipline basically to work with, and this student's discipline was kayaking, basically was paddling, and is just about to set off on a canoe trip from northern Minnesota all the way to Hudson's Bay, all the way across Canada. So like these long distance, deep immersions into wilderness and into the landscape are really inspiring. And there's a long tradition of that, the pilgrimage and the various kind of vision quests into nature as powerful human development and educational.
Absolutely. I think it's great. I've worked with Isaac both at Sterling College and at Schumacher College, which was pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's worth making that point that those are incredibly privileged things for us to be able to do. Obviously, mm-hmm. That doesn't go unnoticed. I mean, they cost a lot of money, they cost a lot of time, and not everybody, very few people have access to those sorts of experiences. So one of the reasons that I'm keen on creating programs of various kinds is to be able to give everybody the access to just building a deeper relationship with the more than human world through some movement practice. And I think during lockdown here was a great experience of you weren't allowed to go out for more than an hour at a time, to take your daily walk, right? So I got very familiar with the hedgerows in my neighborhood, and got to understand that biodiversity and that species relationship, and the foraging opportunities and all of that happened there, right? So I think there are entry points for everyone in this context. And for me, it happens to be, the endurance run or the endurance, adventure race somewhere. But hopefully I can take a kernel of that back and to help inspire others to participate in whatever way they can.
Yeah. Amazing. I need to let you go, Pavel. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your work and your leadership. And thank you for sharing with us here today.
Great. Thanks so much, Jacob. It's been a real pleasure.